Loyalty is supposed to be the unbreakable code of the Mafia, the sacred bond that holds together men who live outside the law, yet insist they live by rules stricter than any government could impose. But what happens when that loyalty fractures from within, when suspicion replaces trust, and when brothers in the same organization begin to see each other as enemies? The story of the Bonanno Family War is not simply about gunfire in dark streets or whispered conspiracies in smoky back rooms. It is about how power, ambition, and fear can corrode even the most disciplined criminal empire. For decades, the Bonanno crime family stood as one of New York's most powerful, organized crime groups, a pillar among the infamous 5 families that dominated the city's underworld. Built on secrecy, hierarchy, and rigid codes of conduct, the organization projected an image of unity and strength. Yet beneath that surface, tensions simmered, loyalties shifted, and quiet rivalries waited for the right moment to erupt. What began as a leadership dispute slowly evolved into a full-scale internal conflict, exposing deep divisions within the organization and weakening its influence during a critical period in American organized crime history. To understand how the internal war nearly tore the Bonanno family apart, it is necessary to first understand the structure that made such a collapse so dangerous. Like other mafia families, the Bonannos operated under a strict hierarchy. At the top was the boss, whose word was final. Beneath him stood the underboss and consigliere, followed by capos who controlled crews of soldiers. Every member swore an oath of loyalty, promising obedience and silence. This structure was designed to prevent chaos, to ensure that orders flowed downward and tribute flowed upward. Discipline was enforced not only by fear of punishment, but by tradition. The Mafia prided itself on continuity, on stability, on respect for established authority. Yet the very rigidity of this system could also become its weakness. When questions about leadership arose, there were limited mechanisms for peaceful resolution. Disputes at the top could paralyze the entire organization, and any sign of instability invited challenges from ambitious figures waiting in the shadows. The seeds of conflict within the Bonanno family were planted during a period when organized crime in New York was already under immense pressure. Federal investigations were becoming more sophisticated. Prosecutors were no longer satisfied with arresting low-level members. They sought to dismantle entire hierarchies using conspiracy laws and long prison sentences. The FBI intensified its surveillance efforts, deploying informants and developing cases that targeted leadership directly. Wiretaps captured conversations once believed to be safe behind closed doors. Undercover operations penetrated businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. This external pressure created an atmosphere of paranoia throughout the Mafia world. Leaders worried not only about rival families, but about betrayal from within. Trust became fragile. Every arrest raised questions. Every unexplained rumor threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power. Within the Bonanno family, leadership uncertainty became the spark that ignited deeper tensions. The authority of the boss, once unquestioned, began to face scrutiny. Some members felt that strategic decisions were weakening the family's position. Others believed that personal ambition was overriding collective interest. Factions quietly formed, each aligning with different visions of how the organization should respond to growing federal pressure and changing criminal opportunities. On the surface, business continued. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, and control over unions and construction projects generated revenue. But internally, mistrust began to circulate. Meetings that once reinforced unity became arenas of subtle power plays. Conversations were measured. Loyalty was tested in small, symbolic ways that revealed deeper allegiances. Power struggles in organized crime are rarely loud at first. They begin with whispers, with speculation about succession, with questions about competence. In the Bonanno family, competing factions gradually reshaped the power structure. Certain capos grew increasingly influential, commanding loyalty from younger members who saw opportunity in change. Others remained firmly aligned with traditional leadership, emphasizing respect for hierarchy and warning that dissent could destroy everything the family had built. These divisions were not immediately violent, but they created fault lines. Each side watched the other carefully, interpreting even routine actions as potential threats. Promotions were scrutinized, financial decisions were questioned, small disagreements took on symbolic importance. As tensions escalated, mistrust eroded the foundation that had sustained the organization for decades. The Mafia's strength relied on a shared belief in secrecy and mutual protection. Once members began to doubt whether their own leadership could safeguard them from federal scrutiny or internal betrayal, that belief weakened. Some individuals started hedging their bets, cultivating relationships with both factions. Others withdrew, avoiding entanglement in open disputes while quietly assessing which side might prevail. This atmosphere of uncertainty created instability that threatened the group's survival more effectively than any rival gang could have. The role of federal law enforcement during this period cannot be overstated. FBI infiltration intensified the chaos inside the Bonanno family. Informants provided detailed accounts of meetings, strategies, and internal disputes. Wiretaps recorded candid discussions that revealed fractures in loyalty. Undercover agents observed the shifting dynamics, feeding intelligence to prosecutors who understood that division within the ranks could be exploited. Each new indictment deepened suspicion. Members wondered who might be cooperating. The possibility that someone close to them was secretly working with the government fueled paranoia. In an organization built on silence, even the slightest hint of disloyalty could provoke severe consequences. The internal war demonstrated a hard truth about organized crime. Sometimes the most dangerous threats come from inside the organization itself. Rival families could be negotiated with, territories could be divided, and disputes could be mediated through established channels. But when conflict erupted within a family, there was no neutral ground. The fight became personal. Allegiances were tested in ways that forced members to choose sides. Long-standing friendships fractured under the weight of political maneuvering. Those who attempted to remain neutral often found themselves mistrusted by both factions. The very code that demanded unwavering loyalty became a weapon used by each side to accuse the other of betrayal. As the conflict intensified, the Bonanno family's influence in New York began to wane. Business partners sensed instability. Other crime families observed the turmoil with cautious interest, sometimes exploiting the distraction to expand their own operations. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded the Bonannos diminished. Internal disputes consumed time and resources that could have been directed toward maintaining power and profitability. Leadership meetings focused less on strategy and more on survival. The hierarchy that had once ensured order now became a battlefield of competing commands and contested authority. What makes the Bonanno Family War particularly significant is not merely the violence or the intrigue, but the lesson it offers about power structures built on fear and secrecy. When transparency is absent and accountability is enforced only through intimidation, small cracks can widen rapidly. In legitimate institutions, disagreements may be resolved through votes, negotiations, or legal procedures. In a mafia family, dissent often carries life or death consequences. This reality escalates conflict rather than containing it. As members question the direction of leadership, the lack of safe mechanisms for dialogue push them toward factional alignment instead of constructive resolution. The broader landscape of American organized crime during this period was undergoing transformation. Media exposure, aggressive prosecution, and public awareness chipped away at the myth of untouchable mob bosses. High-profile trials revealed inner workings that had long been hidden. The public began to see organized crime not as glamorous, but as ruthless and vulnerable. Within this changing environment, the Bonanno family's internal war symbolized a turning point. It illustrated how external pressure combined with internal ambition could destabilize even one of the most entrenched criminal organizations. As mistrust spread, alliances collapsed in ways that few could have predicted. Members who had spent years working side by side suddenly found themselves on opposite ends of strategic debates. Rumors circulated about potential hits, about secret meetings, about negotiations with outside forces. Every action was interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Paranoia became self-reinforcing. The more members feared infiltration, the more they scrutinized each other, and the more that scrutiny deepened divisions. The FBI's presence acted as both a catalyst and a mirror, reflecting the vulnerabilities that already existed within the family. The Bonanno Family War ultimately exposed the fragility of criminal empires that rely solely on dominance and silence. It showed that authority without broad trust is unstable, and that fear can enforce obedience only temporarily. When loyalty becomes conditional, when members calculate their own survival above collective interest, the structure begins to crack. The internal struggle revealed that organized crime groups, despite their rigid codes, are composed of individuals driven by ambition, fear, and personal loyalty. Those human factors can override even the strictest traditions. By the time the conflict reached its peak, the damage was undeniable. The family's unity had been shattered, its hierarchy contested, and its operations disrupted. Law enforcement capitalized on the disarray, pressing forward with investigations that further weakened the organization. The once cohesive front presented to rivals and authorities alike had fractured into competing narratives. The Bonanno family survived, but not without scars that would shape its trajectory for years to come. The internal war served as a stark reminder that in the world of organized crime, the greatest vulnerability often lies not in external enemies, but in the ambitions and suspicions that grow within. As the fractures within the Bonanno family deepened, what had once been a contained leadership dispute transformed into a sustained internal crisis that rippled through every layer of the organization. The conflict was no longer confined to whispered disagreements among high-ranking members. It had become a structural instability that touched soldiers, associates, and even the family's business partners. Power struggles rarely unfold in dramatic bursts at the beginning. Instead, they erode confidence gradually, reshaping perceptions of legitimacy. Within the Bonanno family, questions about authority were no longer abstract concerns debated in private. They became tangible realities that affected how orders were received, how money was distributed, and how discipline was enforced. When members began hesitating before carrying out directives, wondering whether the command truly represented the future of the family, the chain of command lost its clarity. That hesitation alone was enough to weaken the foundation upon which organized crime depends. One of the most dangerous elements of this internal war was the way it forced individuals to choose sides in a system that traditionally punished divided loyalty with severe consequences. In a stable mafia hierarchy, allegiance flows upward in a straightforward manner. But during this period, multiple figures claimed authority, each asserting that they represented the legitimate path forward. Some framed their stance as a necessary correction to protect the family from poor leadership decisions. Others portrayed dissent as outright betrayal that threatened the organization's survival. The rhetoric on both sides hardened. What might have been resolved through careful negotiation instead became framed as a test of honor and obedience. In an environment where reputation carried immense weight, backing down risked appearing weak. As a result, compromise became increasingly unlikely. The instability also disrupted the family's revenue streams. Organized crime depends on predictable systems of collection and distribution. Gambling operations, loan sharking networks, labor racketeering schemes, and construction projects require coordination. When captains questioned the authority of those above them, payments were delayed or redirected. Disputes arose over who had the right to oversee certain territories or businesses. Associates, who were not formally inducted but worked closely with made members, sensed the uncertainty and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Some withheld information, waiting to see which faction would ultimately prevail. Others sought protection from whichever side seemed stronger in the moment. This transactional approach further diluted the unity that the Mafia traditionally demanded. The psychological toll of the internal war cannot be underestimated. Organized crime families cultivate a culture of unwavering loyalty, where members are conditioned to believe that betrayal is the ultimate sin. Yet during the Bonanno conflict, the definition of betrayal itself became contested. Each faction accused the other of undermining tradition. Meetings were conducted with heightened caution. Words were measured, and even casual remarks were scrutinized for hidden meaning. Members avoided speaking openly, fearing that statements could be repeated out of context or used as evidence of disloyalty. This atmosphere of suspicion created isolation. Individuals who once relied on their crew for camaraderie now guarded their thoughts. Trust, once assumed, had to be calculated. Federal investigations intensified precisely as these divisions widened. Law enforcement agencies understood that internal discord presented opportunities. Informants became more valuable during periods of instability, as disillusioned members might be more willing to cooperate in exchange for protection or reduced sentences. Wiretaps captured conversations that revealed not only criminal activity, but also internal grievances. Prosecutors built cases that highlighted fractures, knowing that public exposure of these disputes would further erode the family's mystique. Each indictment added fuel to the fire. Arrests of key figures left power vacuums that competing factions rushed to fill. Courtroom testimony sometimes hinted at deeper rifts, reinforcing the perception that the family was no longer unified. As paranoia grew, the possibility of infiltration loomed over every decision. The fear that someone within the ranks might be cooperating with the FBI became an obsession. Loyalty tests increased. Members were scrutinized for signs of weakness or unusual behavior. In some cases, individuals were marginalized simply because they were perceived as insufficiently committed to one side. The very mechanisms designed to protect the family from informants inadvertently accelerated internal distrust. When members felt they were constantly being evaluated for loyalty, the bonds that once felt organic began to feel transactional. The brotherhood that defined the Mafia's identity became strained under the weight of constant suspicion. The broader criminal landscape in New York also shifted during this period. Rival families observed the Bonanno turmoil carefully. While outright interference risked sparking wider conflict, there were subtle ways to capitalize on another organization's instability. Opportunities to expand influence over lucrative businesses emerged when the Bonannos were distracted by internal battles. Negotiations over territory became more complicated, as it was sometimes unclear which faction possessed the authority to make binding agreements. This uncertainty weakened the family's bargaining position. The perception of vulnerability can be as damaging as vulnerability itself, and competitors understood that the Bonanno family was no longer operating from a position of unquestioned strength. Inside the organization, generational differences played a role in shaping the conflict. Younger members, who had grown up during a period of increased law enforcement pressure, sometimes viewed tradition differently than older leaders who had experienced the Mafia's earlier era of relative dominance. Some believed that adaptation was necessary to survive in a changing environment. Others insisted that strict adherence to established codes was the only path to stability. These differing perspectives influenced factional alignment. The debate was not merely about who should lead, but about what direction the family should take. Should it maintain its traditional structure at all costs, or should it evolve to reduce exposure and risk? Without a unified vision, every strategic decision became a battleground. The internal war also revealed how fragile centralized authority can be when it depends heavily on personal influence. In organized crime, respect for the boss is essential, but that respect is often intertwined with perceptions of competence and protection. When members begin to doubt whether leadership can shield them from prosecution or ensure steady income, loyalty becomes conditional. The Bonanno conflict illustrated this dynamic vividly. As federal indictments mounted and media coverage intensified, some members questioned whether existing leadership had become a liability. This perception, whether accurate or not, fueled arguments for change. Yet advocating change in such a rigid system required challenging the very hierarchy that defined the organization. Violence, while not constant, remained an ever-present possibility. The mere threat of retaliation shaped behavior. Members weighed their words carefully, aware that missteps could have severe consequences. The climate of fear extended beyond those directly involved in leadership disputes. Associates and lower-ranking members felt the tension as well. Business partners noticed disruptions in communication and enforcement. The ripple effects of internal conflict spread outward, touching industries that had long operated under the shadow of Mafia influence. In this way, the Bonanno Family War was not an isolated struggle, but a destabilizing force that impacted broader networks. Media attention further complicated matters. High-profile trials and investigative reporting brought unprecedented scrutiny to organized crime. The public image of the Mafia shifted from one of enigmatic power to one of vulnerability and internal chaos. For an organization that relied on reputation to command respect, this shift was damaging. Public exposure of internal divisions undermined the aura of discipline that had long protected the family from external interference. Rivals, law enforcement, and even potential recruits observed the turmoil. The myth of unwavering unity, so central to Mafia identity, was eroding in real time. Throughout this period, individual survival instincts often overrode collective strategy. Members considered not only which faction to support, but also how to protect themselves legally and financially. Some distanced themselves from controversial decisions. Others sought to strengthen personal alliances that could provide security regardless of which side prevailed. This pragmatic approach further fragmented the organization. Instead of operating as a cohesive entity, the family increasingly resembled a network of competing interests, loosely connected by shared history. The escalation of mistrust created a feedback loop. The more divided the family became, the more attractive cooperation with law enforcement might appear to those who felt marginalized or threatened. Every new rumor of informants intensified suspicion. Every secret meeting sparked speculation. The inability to verify loyalty without breaching secrecy made it impossible to restore full confidence. In such an environment, even well-intentioned efforts to unify the organization were interpreted through a lens of doubt. The Bonanno Family War demonstrated that internal conflicts can be more destructive than external assaults. Law enforcement pressure certainly weakened the organization, but it was the combination of that pressure with internal division that proved most destabilizing. A united family might have weathered investigations more effectively, presenting a cohesive defense and minimizing leaks. Instead, the factional struggle amplified vulnerabilities. Each side's efforts to consolidate power created new openings for prosecutors and investigators. As the conflict continued, the family faced a stark reality. Survival required more than eliminating rivals or silencing dissent. It required rebuilding trust. Yet rebuilding trust in an environment shaped by secrecy and fear was extraordinarily difficult. Attempts to mediate disputes were complicated by entrenched positions. Members who had publicly aligned with one faction risked losing credibility if they attempted reconciliation. The stakes remained high, not only in terms of power but in terms of personal safety. By the end of this phase of the internal war, the Bonanno family had undergone a profound transformation. Its hierarchy had been contested, its unity fractured, and its reputation diminished. While the organization did not collapse entirely, it emerged weakened. Its influence reduced during a critical period in the history of organized crime. The lessons of this internal struggle extended beyond one family. They illustrated how systems built on rigid hierarchy and enforced silence can unravel when leadership disputes intersect with external pressure. The Bonanno family's experience underscored a fundamental truth. In tightly controlled organizations, instability at the top reverberates downward with amplified force. The internal war was not simply a battle for control. It was a revelation of structural vulnerabilities that had long been hidden beneath a facade of strength. By the time the conflict reached its peak, the damage was undeniable. The family's unity had been shattered, its hierarchy contested, and its operations disrupted. Law enforcement capitalized on the disarray, pressing forward with investigations that further weakened the organization. The once cohesive front presented to rivals and authorities alike had fractured into competing narratives. The Bonanno family survived, but not without scars that would shape its trajectory for years to come. The internal war served as a stark reminder that in the world of organized crime, the greatest vulnerability often lies not in external enemies, but in the ambitions and suspicions that grow within. By the time the internal struggle reached its most critical stage, the Bonanno family was no longer fighting merely over leadership titles or symbolic authority. It was fighting for coherence, for identity, and ultimately for survival. The organization that had once projected an image of disciplined unity now found itself navigating a landscape defined by fractured loyalties and lingering suspicion. Every decision carried consequences that extended beyond immediate power calculations. The question was no longer simply who would control the family, but whether the family, as it had long existed, could continue to function at all. In an underworld where perception shaped influence, the visible cracks within the Bonanno hierarchy signaled weakness to rivals. to business partners, and most significantly, to federal investigators who had spent years attempting to dismantle organized crime from the outside. The prolonged conflict had reshaped relationships in ways that could not easily be reversed. Members who had once relied on instinctive trust now operated with guarded caution. Old alliances were remembered through the lens of betrayal, and gestures of reconciliation were examined for hidden motives. Even as certain leaders attempted to stabilize the situation, the memory of division lingered. Trust, once broken, does not return simply because a new structure is declared. It must be rebuilt slowly, and in an organization bound by secrecy, that process is especially difficult. Every pledge of loyalty required verification, and verification often demanded surveillance, informal loyalty tests, or exclusion of those perceived as unreliable. The culture of suspicion that had grown during the internal war did not vanish when the most intense dispute subsided. It remained embedded in the organization's behavior. Federal law enforcement continued to capitalize on the instability. Years of investigations had yielded detailed knowledge of the family's operations, and prosecutors understood that a divided organization was more vulnerable to strategic pressure. Informants who might have hesitated to cooperate during a period of unity now saw an environment in which internal protection seemed uncertain. The fear that leadership could not guarantee safety from prosecution or retaliation made cooperation a more calculated option for some individuals. Wiretaps and surveillance operations expanded, capturing not only evidence of criminal activity, but also candid expressions of frustration and doubt among members. Each successful prosecution reinforced the perception that the Bonanno family was struggling to maintain control over its own ranks. The internal war also altered how the family approached its traditional revenue streams. Stability is essential for illegal enterprises that depend on routine collections and negotiated territories. After prolonged factional conflict, the Bonannos had to re-establish clarity over who controlled which operations. Disputes that might once have been settled quietly now carried the memory of recent divisions. Captains sought to secure their own positions, sometimes prioritizing personal strength over collective coordination. In certain sectors, competitors sensed opportunity and encroached on areas that had previously been uncontested. The family's diminished aura of unity reduced its deterrent effect. In organized crime, the belief that retaliation will be swift and coordinated is often more powerful than retaliation itself. When that belief weakens, challenges multiply. Beyond financial consequences, the internal war reshaped the family's culture. Younger members who had witnessed open factionalism grew up with a different understanding of loyalty than their predecessors. Instead of viewing allegiance as a demonstrate of unquestioned obedience to a singular authority, they had seen firsthand how leadership could be contested and how internal politics could redefine the hierarchy. This shift in perspective subtly transformed expectations. While the Mafia code continued to emphasize silence and obedience, the lived experience of division made those ideals less absolute. The myth of perfect unity had been replaced by a more pragmatic recognition that power within the organization was subject to negotiation and change. The psychological impact of the conflict lingered as well. Members who had survived the most volatile periods carried memories of uncertainty and fear. They had navigated a time when aligning with the wrong faction could end careers, or worse. That experience reinforced caution. Decisions were weighed not only in terms of profit, but also in terms of long-term security. The instinct to avoid drawing attention became even stronger. In some ways, the internal war produced a more risk-averse organization, one less inclined to pursue aggressive expansion and more focused on preserving what remained. Yet this defensive posture also limited growth. The Bonanno family, once counted among the most formidable of New York's crime groups, operated with reduced confidence. At the same time, the broader landscape of organized crime was evolving. Federal racketeering laws had proven effective in targeting entire leadership structures. High-profile convictions across multiple families demonstrated that no boss was untouchable. The era when organized crime could operate with relative invisibility had ended. Against this backdrop, the Bonanno family's internal divisions served as a cautionary example to others. Rival families observed the consequences of prolonged factionalism and sought to avoid similar scenarios within their own ranks. The lesson was clear. External pressure combined with internal discord could accelerate decline. Attempts to restore order within the Bonanno family required more than simply appointing new leaders. They required reaffirming a shared narrative of purpose. Leadership figures emphasized tradition, invoking the history of the organization and the sacrifices of earlier generations. Ceremonial gatherings and reaffirmations of loyalty aimed to signal a return to stability. Yet such gestures could not erase the reality that the family had been forced to confront its own vulnerabilities. The internal war had demonstrated that authority was not immune to challenge, and that secrecy could not fully shield the organization from exposure. The conflict also revealed a paradox at the heart of organized crime. The Mafia depends on strict hierarchy and enforced loyalty, yet those very structures can magnify the consequences of leadership disputes. In legitimate institutions, power transitions often occur through established procedures. In the underworld, transitions can become flashpoints. The absence of transparent mechanisms for resolving disagreements means that ambition and fear often dictate outcomes. During the Bonanno Family War, this dynamic played out with destabilizing effect. What might have remained a contained disagreement escalated because there was no neutral forum for arbitration. Every attempt to assert authority risked provoking further resistance. As years passed, the Bonanno family gradually regained a measure of operational stability, but it did so in a changed environment. Its influence, while still significant, no longer carried the same unquestioned dominance. The internal war had cost more than temporary disruption. It had cost reputation. In the world of organized crime, reputation functions as both shield and sword. It deters aggression and commands compliance. Once tarnished, it requires sustained effort to restore. The Bonannos faced the challenge of demonstrating reliability to allies and caution to adversaries, all while navigating ongoing legal scrutiny. The story of the Bonanno Family War ultimately underscores a broader truth about power. Systems built on secrecy and fear may appear solid from the outside, but their stability depends on internal cohesion. When cohesion erodes, the structure weakens, regardless of how formidable it once seemed. The conflict showed that loyalty enforced by oath alone is insufficient if confidence in leadership falters. It revealed how external pressure can exacerbate internal fault lines, turning manageable disputes into existential crises. Most importantly, it illustrated that the greatest threat to a tightly controlled organization may come not from rivals or authorities, but from within its own ranks. In reflecting on this period, it becomes evident that the Bonanno family's internal war was more than a chapter in Mafia history. It was a case study in organizational fragility. It demonstrated how ambition, mistrust, and fear can converge to destabilize even long-standing institutions. The family survived, but survival came with adaptation. Greater caution, increased compartmentalization, and a renewed emphasis on minimizing exposure became central strategies. Yet the memory of division remained a reminder of how quickly unity can unravel. The internal war also reshaped the narrative of organized crime in the public imagination. Media coverage of trials and investigations highlighted not only criminal enterprises, but also the human conflicts behind them. The image of monolithic mafia families gave way to a more complex understanding of shifting loyalties and contested authority. For observers, the Bonanno conflict revealed that organized crime groups are not immune to the same internal dynamics that affect any organization. Rivalry, ambition, disagreement, and the struggle for legitimacy. The difference lies in the stakes and the methods by which disputes are resolved. Ultimately, the Bonanno Family War serves as a powerful example of how internal conflicts can be more damaging than external threats. While federal investigations and FBI infiltration intensified the chaos, They succeeded in part because the organization was already divided. Informants, wiretaps, and undercover operations accelerated the breakdown, but the foundation had been weakened by mistrust. The lesson extends beyond organized crime. Any institution that neglects internal cohesion while focusing solely on external competition risks similar instability. As the dust settled, the Bonanno family continued to operate, but its trajectory had been altered. The internal war marked a turning point, a moment when the illusion of invulnerability was permanently dispelled. Power remained, but it was tempered by experience. Authority persisted, but it carried the memory of challenge. The organization moved forward with a heightened awareness that loyalty must be nurtured as well as demanded. Whether that awareness would prevent future divisions remained uncertain, but the history of the conflict stood as a warning, etched into the family's legacy. The story ends not with a dramatic final confrontation, but with a sobering realization. In the world of organized crime, unity is both weapon and shield. When unity fractures, the consequences ripple outward, weakening defenses and inviting attack. The Bonanno Family War demonstrated that sometimes the most destructive battles are fought not in the streets, but within conference rooms and whispered conversations, where suspicion replaces trust and ambition overshadows tradition. It showed that the collapse of loyalty can destabilize even the most powerful structures, and that rebuilding from such fractures requires more than force. It requires confronting the vulnerabilities that allowed division to take root in the first place. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.